Hi gang, so I've done a few non-metallic videos, and one of the most asked things that I've had as a response from those is how does lighting work? So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to go through static lighting and mainly dynamic lighting. So here, static lighting is essentially flat light. It's when you have a cube like this and it's lit from kind of top diagonal. So the top is going to be super bright, the side is going to be kind of medium mid-tone, and then the back is going to be just black, essentially. It's going to be shadow. For dynamic lighting, it just makes objects more interactive with the environment. So this is what you're going to think of as more non-metallic and how that works. So essentially, when the light hits this cube, it's going to hit it and it's going to put the most light on the edge furthest away from the light source. It's going to create that nice edge. And then on the side of the cube, you're still going to have mainly mid-tone, but you're just going to bring it up at the corners and bring it down at that opposite corner to have that extra shadow. And then on the back, where it was previously just black on the static one, you are going to bring some of that mid-tone down from that bright corner from the top of the cube. There are reasons for this. It's a little complicated with like physics and stuff. So essentially just remember, you don't want two of the same colors touching. You want to have your bright edge next to either a mid-tone or the shadow. You want to have the mid-tone edge next to the dark or the bright. You don't want to have a dark edge next to a dark edge, because then you lose that corner, you lose that definition in the volume, and you want to keep it quite separated. So if I was to copy paste the static cube onto itself, you would still be able to see the cube, kind of. Because the mid-tone side, if you stuck the extra cube into the middle of the mid-tone side, the top of the cube will be at contrast with the mid-tone. You will see the top of the second cube. You will see the side of the second cube because it will be black. The front of the cube, that is the same mid-tone, it's going to get lost. You can no longer see that. If you take the dynamic cube that I've done here and you paste it on top of each other in the same place, you're going to still be able to see all of those edges because they are all defined from each other. There is nothing smooth and flat. Starting with a little exercise you might recognize from school, we're just going to do some practice in finding the values that we want on objects. So to start off, we're going to go with static lighting, and we're just going to do these flat colored sides to work out where the light is going to be. This is very simple. You're going to recognize doing this, like this is generally what things look like in real life, just because of the way that light is dissipated and it isn't like a strong spotlight in most cases. So on the cube, we're just going to color each edge a different shade of gray. So the light source is going to be coming in from a diagonal from the top. So the top of the cube is going to be super bright. The front of the cube is going to be that mid-tone gray color, and then the back is going to be black. Same on the cylinder, we're going to do the top super bright, and then it's going to have this nice white side, and then the mid-tone in the middle, and then the black on the back of it. Generally on these shapes, it's around a third of each tone, of each value. So you're going to have 1/3 of the object being light, 1/3 being middle tone, and 1/3 being dark. On the cube, this is sort of super easy because you can only see 3 faces and each face is a different value. On the cylinder, you have all 3 values on the curve on the side, and then 1 value on top. On the sphere, there are 2 ways you can do this. You can either color it in like you're doing a moon and do like a crescent moon shape and keep that highlight right on the edge. Or you can fill that in and create this sort of Neapolitan tennis ball type shape. And it still looks 3D, it's just sort of highlighted a bit further round rather than from more behind. And then for the cone, we're essentially doing what we did for the cylinder. We're going to split it into 3 chunks. We're going to have a dark chunk, a mid chunk, and a light chunk. A cone is just a cylinder with the top pinched. So you can always do the little point at the top as if it's the top of the cylinder and have like a little boopy top. Don't worry about the blending at this point, I'm just doing it so you can better see the shape rather than just have a solid corner of each tone. It is my recommendation, if you are struggling with lighting, draw yourself a page with these shapes on it and just work out where you want your light to be and color it in, and just practice putting light from a different angle and different areas, maybe from behind, maybe from more in front, maybe from more central, and just work out where that wants to be. It's a really good exercise. It's very like going back to school, but it's very useful, especially if you're painting. So this second circle, this is top down on the cone. So you're just kind of creating those light and darks and keeping that nice and circular. So this is static lighting. This is more dissipated as it is in real life, where everything is kind of evenly lit from a large light source. It's very non-dramatic, it's very plain. This is fine. It looks good. You could do this as cell shaded if you wanted to. If you don't want to do the blending, that's fine. If you want to go for a more dramatic look, we're gonna now move on to dynamic lighting. So keeping the light source in the same place, I'm now just gonna go and edit where I've done the static lighting to create some more interesting shapes on these shapes. So like I said previously at the start of the video, you want to get the light hitting that furthest edge away from the source. So on the cube on the top, it's going to be here. On the cylinder on the top, it's going to be there. And on the sphere, you're just going to have the spot, the classic spot. On the cone, it's going to be this long line, which is also going to be on the side of the cylinder. I do tend to keep these highlights away from the edge, just so I can have that extra little darkness around that front side. On the cone from the top, you want to keep that side highlight, but I would also probably just do an extra little one just off to the side of that. I think it just looks quite nice. And then going back to the cube, putting that highlight away from the light source again in this bottom right corner. And this is the mid-tone shade, so you don't want to go super dark, but you don't want to go too bright either. And then on this dark side, we're going to keep it mainly dark and just put some sort of mid-tone at the top. Just blending it out a bit so you can see kind of what I'm going for. So when I'm talking about value in painting, in drawing, coloring, whatever, is the lightness or darkness of a color. If it's brighter, it has more value. If it's darker, it has less value. I kind of think of it in terms of saturation. So if you have a lot of color showing because it's bright, because there's lots of light going on, it's going to have a high value. If it's got a lot of shadow going on and it's not very saturated, it doesn't have a lot of value. If you're doing photography, then this is the exposure on your camera. So if you've ever messed with a kind of nice camera, or even on your phone nowadays, there's an exposure setting with those numbers. The higher the number you pick, the brighter the image is. The lower the value of that number is, the darker your photo is going to be. That is the value when we're talking about that. Now we have a general idea of how light interacts with those shapes. We can now have a look at something like a space marine. The light, we're going to say it's the sun coming from the top. We're going to treat all of the shapes, all the individual parts of the space marine as different shapes. Here I'm blocking in the trim and the spot on the shoulder. So the shoulder, it's a sphere, mainly. It does have the flat bits at the sides, and we treat those bits as a cube. Like this bit of trim, it's this bit of the cube that we shaded in the last section. And then we just do the same sort of thing, splitting him into shapes. So his head is like a cylinder, might be a bit spherical on the top as well, but it's generally this shape. So you can see how I'm blocking in the light that lines up in the way that a cylinder would work, with a bit of curve at the top. So his jetpack is the same thing. It's a sphere where the turbo bits come out, and then it's a horizontal cylinder. So we're just gonna mark those on, and then I quickly did the arm. Also, it's just made out of cylinders. So blocking in some shadows, you want to do this the same way as we did on the worksheet. Keep the shadows kind of close to the highlights so that you get that super high contrast between those values. And then I just blended it out quickly, and just to show how it looks, you can do this with your minis. Paint them in black and white if that helps you get the lighting, and then just contrast over it and you have very quick, very easy non-metallic, for example. The other point that I would make, it's not really a lighting thing, it's purely a composition thing. When you have different sections, like his armor on his arm is kind of separated into a few cylinders, you want to keep those separate. You want to keep like a lining between them, so I'm just bringing the black up through those recesses between the cylinder. It doesn't really make sense lighting wise, but it just adds a bit of separation to keep it interesting. Now, just to show that you don't have to do it like blue or yellow, you can use whatever color you want. I do change this to blue just so it's a blue space marine. So the other difficult part of doing space marines, I find, is the bird on the front. It has a lot of points where it wants to reflect the light, such as the tips of the wings, but if you do it too much, you can lose that definition because they're so small. So I would just do the tips of the wings, and then do a kind of line up through to make those shiny spots, but then just go back to doing the tips of the wings. So you still have that essence of direction of light with those lines that you put on the bigger parts that aren't just wingtips. And then you want to go and, again, darken the recesses between those shapes, just so you can distinguish the shapes from themselves, so it doesn't turn into one blob of mid-tone. And again, just contrast over it, you've got a gold. Well done. So when trying to describe different materials using lighting, you want to try and keep these two values, the dark shadow and the top highlight, very close together. The closer they are together, the more shiny the material will look. The more mid-tone you put in between those two values, the more matte the material is going to be. So on this Space Marine, he's very shiny. He's made out of metal. So on these orbs, you can see that when you put a tiny bit of mid-tone around that highlight, it looks a lot more shiny because of that bigger contrast between the values. You're essentially going from a -10 to a +10. with a tiny bit of 0 in between. Whereas when you want it to be softer, when you want to make a cloth or a skin, you want to increase that 0 amount, so you have a much bigger change between the -10 and the +10. Now looking at a more complex shape, like the helmet, we want to keep the helmet in kind of 2 halves. His right side, our left looking at it, is going to be a lot more bright than his left side, because the left side is obviously slanted away from where the lighting is. On the right side, we are going to bring it up to that top highlight, where on the left side, I'm not going to bring it up that high. I'm going to bring it to the mid-tone and maybe a little bit higher, but it's never going to reach that super high hat highlight as the other side. Another thing you can look out for in lighting as you progress as a painter is the difference between cast shadowed and form shadows. So a cast shadow is something like if you hold your hand over your desk and it creates that sharp-edged shadow, whereas a form shadow is something like the side of your face slowly becomes darker on the opposite side to the light source. It's a very soft-edged shadow as opposed to the harsh-edged cast shadow. On this Space Marine, you can look at that on things like the side of his face, where the sharp point on the front of his mask creates a very harsh line between the top highlight on the peak of his nose section, as opposed to the soft curve on the top of the helmet, creating that soft form shadow. If you're lost and confused, that's fine. We're gonna go and break down these shapes into the basics of what they are. Full Charlie Day. Starting with the shoulder, as I said before, is a sphere, mainly. It does have that little bit of cube on the side, but it's mainly a sphere. The arm, it's a cylinder. Essentially with any object and any animal, person, whatever, they're essentially a load of spheres, cylinders, all stuck together to create whatever object it is. For example, now the top of the head is a sphere, but it's a bit more complex. It has a cylinder attached to it. It's a sphere with a cylindrical top. Amazing. You know how to paint both of these things, so you can just jam them together and you'll get it. The trim on the shoulder, it's a cube. You know how to color in a cube. You can do this. Good job. You just need a bit of faith in the system and understanding the basic concepts of shapes, because as soon as you've got them, it's you can paint whatever you want, essentially. As long as you know how shapes work, you'll be grand. You'll be fine. So this is another slightly complex one. The leg armor. It's a couple of cylinders stacked on top of each other. You know how to paint cylinders. You can do it. The sides of the cylinders might be more cubish, might be a bit more flat, but again, you know how to paint a cube. Just make one side of the cube curved, and there you have a cylinder attached to a cube, which is essentially the shape of his leg armor. 10 out of 10, you can do it. Just have a little faith in yourself, you'll be fine. The other thing that I get asked about is flat surfaces. Flat surfaces can be harder to light because you are used to seeing flat surfaces with a more dissipated light on them, such as from house lights. This is going to make the top surface appear kind of all one shine, all one value, whereas when you see non-metallic on things like swords, it's always with 2 or 3 points of light throughout the sword. This looks a lot nicer on minis than just doing one flat value, like you would possibly see in a non-dramatic, static type of lighting. So here we're gonna just think of the sword in its 3D-ness, in that kind of diamond shape. And you want to have your highlight at either end on one side, and then in the center on the other side. Thinking back to the start, with the cubes stacking on top of each other, you don't really want the colors to touch. So your highlight at either end is not going to touch the highlight in the middle, and your midtones will overlap, but that's inevitable. That's going to be the longest part on your non-metallic on a sword or a flat surface. And then obviously put your shadows in. On things like swords, this does look better if you space them out like this and have 2 points on one side and one on the other, or points opposite each other, but that can look a bit funny sometimes. I would also do a white edge highlight up the center and along the edges. I think it just makes it look a little more neat. The other type of sword that you do see is one with a flat surface running down the center. So we're gonna have that flat surface. We've kept the angled bits at the sides the same. And to do the flat bit, because we have those highlights on the angled bits, we're just gonna basically draw a line between them, and that's gonna be your highlight. On the top, where there's only one lit bit, we're just gonna highlight that side. Ideally at the same angle as the other one across the flat surface, just to make it look more real. If you do the angles different, it will look odd. Even if you've done it as perfect as you can with the blending and everything, if those angles are off, it's gonna look a bit odd. So it's just practice doing that, I'm afraid. Same as with the light, you just kind of want to link up those dark areas as well to create those alternating, contrasting value stripes. And I just blended it, and I went round it with a white sort of on the edge, just to distinguish the edges from each other. And you've got a pretty good sword. Good job. The other type of weapon I get asked about is things like axes. These also have a flat area most of the time with the slanted axe face. So you can approach this the same way as the sword and do a 3-point of light attack. So you can do the tips really bright and then one in the middle. This works quite well depending on where your light is coming from. It can look quite good. If it doesn't quite look great, if it doesn't look the best, you can move this around, and I will show this in a second. Just keeping the 3 points at the moment, you are doing essentially the same thing as you did on the flat bit of the sword. You're keeping that top corner as a highlight, kind of doing a diagonal from the center highlight of the slanted bit, and then you want to do another line from the bottom point to the top of the axe. It won't necessarily meet the corners like this one has, but you just kind of want to play around with it, see what looks good. It's kind of easy with non-metallic because you know when it doesn't look right, so you can just kind of mess around with your angles, see what looks actually decent, and change things. So here, if you're not happy with the 3 points, you can just extend the shadow and extend the highlight to create 1 point of highlight. This is quite good if the light source is coming at such an angle that it just sort of clips the top of the weapon and doesn't fully engulf it in light. You can generally tell if the lighting is off and just move things around until they look good. There is a lot of uncanny valley you will find yourself painting when doing non-metallic. The next kind of breakdown I want to show is just how people are essentially made. If you didn't understand how I broke the Space Marine up into parts, hopefully this kind of explains it a little better. So a person's neck is a cylinder, a head is a circle or an egg. The body is generally drawn as a rectangle, but you can curve the front. and the shoulders are spheres, with more cylinders hanging off them as arms. So picking the light source as the sun, just from that sort of front side angle, you just want to find your shapes as you drew them, or on the Mini, and fill them in as you normally would. So looking more at materials this time, a head, skin, it's not very shiny. You're gonna have those high patches on the cheekbones and on the top of the head and on the chin, but you're not gonna have any super high shine unless you have a shiny bald head. So you're gonna keep a lot of the head as mid-tone, so then it doesn't look super shiny, just because that contrast between the dark shadow and the high highlight is miles apart. As opposed to if he was wearing a plate of armor on his front. It's gonna have a sheen to it, it's gonna have a shiny bit, and on the shoulder as well. But the distance between the shadow and the shiny bit is gonna be a lot smaller. Therefore making that piece of armor look shiny. So on the skin, it's a slow change between the -10, for example, to the +10 in the values. And on the shirt, the shiny armor, it's a really quick change between the -10 and the +10. This is generally how you make things more shiny. So looking at it from these spheres point of view, like we did on the Space Marine, if you want something super matte, you want a lot of mid-tone. You want to create that distance. And then if you want something shiny, you want to decrease that distance. So on the matte, that distance basically tells you how the light is dissipating, whereas if it's shiny, the light is reflecting more. It's not spreading out as much, it's just directly reflecting. So it's gonna be smaller. Just color it in quickly to show you what it looks like. On to some real world examples. This is a Sisters of Silence cape that I've been working on. It's a rectangle, it's a cape, but the cape has volume to it. It is made out of these cylinders. Some are inverse, some are not. And you can see how I've shaded and highlighted this section with this long drawing out of the highlight. It makes it look more matte. It doesn't look shiny, but it has that brightness to it that you can tell that there's a volume there. It's just not made out of metal. It's a lot more matte. And then on the other side is an inverse cone, which has the shadow in it. And again, it's a very long change between the top and the bottom of the shadow. Thinking about it as cones, you can see where I decided on how these lighting structures were going to work on the cape. My second example is my grots on a horse. You can see that this back panel of the horse is kind of a weird shape, but you can work this out. It's a cube with a cylinder attached to it, essentially. So when I did the lighting for this, I put the lighting at the top of the cylinder, or the sphere at the top, and then I put it at the bottom edge of the cube at the bottom edge. And it creates this really nice effect of creating depth. And then on the neck of the horse, it's a cylinder. It's a curved cylinder, but it's a cylinder. So it's still gonna have that single line of highlight down the side, but it's gonna follow the shape of the cylinder, which is a curve. And then to look at the sword, it has this kind of funky shape. So we're going to kind of break it down a little bit. You have this triangle in the middle, and like I said with the cubes at the start that were stacked on top, we don't want the colors to touch. So I'm gonna I've put the bright pot of the right side of the sword opposite on to the bright part on the triangle. This just creates a little bit of distance between them to show that they're different surfaces. And then obviously the shadow is then opposite on the other side. So just to show it kind of colored in, so you can see where I'm kind of going. This is just how it kind of works on that bit of the back of the horse, with those highlighted bits, and then just going in with the super high contrast just to create that extra bit of distance. But you see how I'm covering up a lot of the mid-tone with that dark shadow, just to create that extra shininess. Whereas when I show you in a second on his cape, there's a lot less interaction or less distance between that dark shadow and that top highlight. So on the horse, again, creating that distance, but not too much distance, just so it maintains that shininess. Just to use it on a straight cylinder, just so you can kind of see if you're not really following too well with the curved surface. It's essentially the same as the flat surface. So on the cape, as with the sister's cape, it's just a load of cones, so you want to color it like a cone. And because it is cloth, it's not super shiny, I've decreased the amount of dark shadow and increased the amount of mid-tone that I'm using. This makes it look a lot more muted. It's not as shiny, but it's still very much that shape. I hope this helps. I do recommend getting some paper and just practicing moving a light source around and drawing it on to a piece of paper of those shapes. If you have something that's a cube, like a dice or some sort of metal box, and just hold a torch up and see what it looks like. It's the easiest way to look at lighting, is to just find physical objects and look and watch how they interact with lighting and how light reflects off of them. A lot of art is just observation in the real world and trying to transfer that and translate it down into what you are working on. Let me know in the comments if you have any other questions regarding lighting. I will do a much shorter video on OSL just to finish this kind of topic. If you have any other questions or anything you think I've missed or you need help with, please let me know and I'll try and include it in that video, or I'll make another one. So yeah, I hope this helped. Let me know how it goes. If you are having trouble adding color to your lighting, just paint things in black and white, contrast over it. It looks really good. I have entered competitions doing things like that on my minis, and people think that I glazed or wet blended with those colors when it's actually just black and white with a contrast over it. You'll be fine. Good luck. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe. Bye bye.